Hamas has answered a proposal that could halt the fighting in the Gaza Strip. As part of the deal, Hamas will have to release the remaining hostages who are in its custody, and Israel, for its part, will have to allow more aid to reach desperate Palestinians. Confirmation of Hamas's positive response came from both US as well as Qatari leaders in a joint press conference in Doha. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has dashed these hopes by spurning the proposal from Hamas on Wednesday. At a news conference in Doha with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman bin Jassim Al Thani, who's Qatar's Prime Minister, said that the negotiators, that is Qatar, Egypt, the United States, have received a positive response from Hamas. He said, and I quote, that the reply includes some comments, but in general it is positive. He declined to offer any further details, but said the counter-offer had been delivered to Israeli officials. Sheikh Mohammed said that overall he was positive regarding the direction of the talks. Antony Blinken, who's on his fifth trip to the Middle East since this war began, also met with Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, who's the Emir of Qatar, and the President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, in Cairo. There's a lot of work to be done, but we continue to believe that an agreement is possible and indeed essential. We will continue to work relentlessly to achieve it. That is what Blinken told reporters in Doha. But right after meeting Blinken, Netanyahu rejected the peace offer and said that the only way the war would end was with the total annihilation of Hamas. Netanyahu asserted that victory was within reach as the war hit the 4-month mark. There is growing concern among Israeli officials that their forces are getting bogged down. The Hamas reply, though, came as a bit of a surprise to both US and Qatari officials. The White House had little time to review the details of the Hamas proposal before it was publicly asked about it. Qatari officials received the Hamas proposal just an hour before Blinken arrived in Doha for his first meeting. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden told reporters in Washington that there had been some movement in the talks and that Hamas's proposal seems to be a little over the top. There is continuing negotiation right now, is what Biden said.
There's some movement. There's been a response from the opposition, but yes, I'm sorry, from Hamas, but it seems to be a little over the top. We're not sure where it is. There's a continuing negotiation right now.
In a statement, Hamas has also said that it had dealt with the framework that was proposed by the intermediaries, Qatar and Egypt, in a positive frame of mind. It did not elaborate further on what exactly the details of this deal were. But the militant group did reaffirm its prior demands. Number one, that there should be a permanent ceasefire. Number two, the reconstruction of Gaza. Number three, the end of Israel's blockade. And number four, the release of all Palestinian prisoners who are in Israeli jails. Israel has not agreed to any of these set conditions. A key obstacle in the Hamas plan, according to Israeli officials, was a demand that Israeli troops completely withdraw from Gaza. Netanyahu has repeatedly vowed that his forces will not stop fighting until Hamas is fully crushed. An Israeli official suggested that Israel was dissatisfied with Hamas's answer. Israel's understanding is that Hamas wanted a deal only if it ensured that Hamas continued to keep control of Gaza, and that would end the war. Now, both of those conditions have been rejected in the past by Israel. Israel sees only one end to this war, and that is when Hamas is fully defeated, meaning that Hamas will be forced to cede all control of the Gaza Strip. Israel's spy agency, the Mossad, has said in a statement that it had received the Hamas reply from Qatar and its details are being examined in depth by all officials who are engaged in the negotiations. Both Egypt and Qatar have been key intermediaries negotiating with the leaders of Hamas. The proposal was initially put forth by the United States, and it could temporarily stop the war. Now, the nub of the deal is this, that Hamas would free all the remaining hostages who are in its custody in exchange for Palestinians who are held in Israeli jails. Also, as part of the bargain, Israel would allow more food, water, medicine, as well as other basic supplies into the Gaza Strip. But there are no explicit signs of consent from either side. And part of the reason is this. As these talks have continued between various emissaries, Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who's been leading this war effort, he has said that Israeli troops could be pushing further south into Rafah. Now, Rafah is the southernmost point between Gaza and Egypt. It's a crossing widely believed to be used by more than 1 million Palestinians who have had to flee this war. The United Nations says more than half the population of Gaza has fled since the start of this war. Israel's aerial bombardment, followed by its ground offensive and then evacuation orders. First, it was in northern Gaza, and then they have moved south. All of this has forced many million people to flee, not just once, but on multiple occasions. Rafah happens to be the last remaining point before the fleeing population is forced out of Gaza's borders and into Egypt, a proposal which Egypt is loath to accept. The Israeli Defense Minister, Gallant, has called Rafah the last stronghold remaining in Hamas's hands. He in fact gave an ultimatum to Hamas fighters there: surrender or die. While the Israeli army commanders consider Rafah as their next operational target, the security establishment needs to complete much more planning before they decide to send in ground troops into Rafah. Because entering Rafah will be extremely complicated given the sheer number of people who've been squeezed into this tiny city. It will mean more civilian deaths, something which Israel has received a lot of flack for already. It was even taken to the International Court of Justice by South Africa precisely for this reason. The ICJ, in its verdict a few days ago, had explicitly asked Israel to stop murdering more civilians. Also, Israel will need to keep in mind Egyptian sensitivities if there is a mass-scale fighting that happens so close to the Egyptian border. Israeli leaders have vowed to crush Hamas after it led an attack on southern Israel on the 7th of October. That attack killed about 1,200 Israelis, and Hamas seized more than 250 hostages. Almost half of those hostages were freed by the end of November. Back at that time, too, there was an exchange of Palestinian prisoners who were held in Israeli prisons. Since then, Israeli officials believe that at least 50 of the hostages have died in captivity. But they are hopeful that there may be more than 100 who are still alive. Israel's retaliatory bombing and its invasion of Gaza have already killed more than 27,000 people, according to Gaza's health officials. It has also forced more than 1 million to flee, and more than half of Gaza's buildings have been destroyed. But whether or not this peace proposal, mooted by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, will be accepted by both Hamas and Israel, that is still a million-dollar question. Ultimately, it boils down to one thing: the pressure that the global community has brought to bear on Israel, and whether Israel's political establishment, including its current leader Benjamin Netanyahu, can withstand that pressure, and B, whether their military objective of defeating Hamas and ensuring that Hamas cedes all control of Gaza, whether that is achievable in and of itself. Between these two realities hangs the fate of this peace proposal.